thank you to everyone who's joined us for this first Australia United Arab Emirates Business Council webinar. I'm Christopher Pine and I'm the co-chair on the Australian side of the council, and my co-chair is Badr Al-Alama from Mubadala in the UAE, and Badr will say a few words after me, and then we plan to hand over to Joe Masters, who's from Ernst & Young or EY, who's going to moderate a panel of Michael Sukkar, the Assistant Treasurer and a member for Deakin, and a former colleague of mine, who has particular responsibility for foreign investment in Australia, and Dr. Tariq bin Hendi, who is the head of the Abu Dhabi Investment Office, who's in Abu Dhabi today, and Badr can tell us whether he's in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. This is the first of the Australia UAE Business Council events. We'd hoped, of course, to have more in-person events, but COVID pandemic has meant that that hasn't been possible yet. We hope it will be next year and the year after, but rather than wait, we decided to get on and create a webinar series and a working group program for the Australia UAE Business Council that mirrors these webinars, and we hope to have 4 or 5 of these over the next year, 12 months, financial year, as well as other events in person, and a launch in Sydney on November the 25th by the Prime Minister. So the council is underway. It's very exciting. I drove the creation of the council on the Australian side because, as a minister, having visited the Emirates many times, I was surprised there wasn't a council of this kind at the higher level and the higher end of people participating. And we hope to be a bespoke council that assists the relationship between Australia and the United Arab Emirates from a business and government point of view. Obviously, there are many different areas where we can cooperate. And the first of those, one of the things that our members have said to us very loudly, is we want to know more about foreign investment, the changes the government's made in Australia, the attractiveness of Australia to foreign investment and two-way investment back into the United Arab Emirates. And so we're kicking off with that subject today. And I'm happy, I think I've said enough for a webinar. As Michael knows, I could speak at great length and ruin the whole event, but I'll happily hand over to my co-chair, Badr Al-Alama, and he can say a few words and then the webinar will get underway. Badr.
Thank you, Christopher. And just building on my respected co-chair's words, obviously the relationship between Australia and the UAE is deep and profound. And you know, joining him was actually an absolute honor. And starting off with the webinar, having my dear friend Dr. Tariq bin Hendi join us and talk a little bit about not just the Abu Dhabi Economic Strategy 2030, but also talk about the next 50 years. For those that are joining the webinar today, the UAE is going to be 50 years old next year. And this year, specifically 2020, was about planning for the next 50 years of our development, which is pretty much a brilliant opportunity for us to think about, you know, in terms of Australian companies, in terms of developing capabilities, new technologies. And I couldn't stress more that it was such an honor to start off the webinar, even though we could not meet in person, Christopher, but like you said, you know, we need to get on with it, and I do joining us hopefully with a few other webinars and a few other members, so we could really develop this relationship further and identify new opportunities for collaboration. So I'll keep it limited and I'll keep it short. Joe, I'll hand over to you, and really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Fantastic, and thanks for that. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Christopher said, I'm Joe Masters. I'm the Chief Economist here at EY for Oceania. And for those of you that don't know, EY's corporate purpose is all around building a better working world. And I can't think of a better way to express that than to join you this afternoon and look at how we can build cooperation with friends overseas and what that means for our economy and also for investment relationships and other relationships, as Christopher mentioned. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists. Many of you would know the Honourable Michael Sukkar, the member for Deakin since 2013, and of course the Assistant Treasurer, which is no easy task in the year 2020. Michael left a career in law and, dare I say it, consulting practice to join Federal Parliament. And in addition to investment, has been particularly vocal around infrastructure, but also community safety and, of course, support for his local community, which is an incredibly important part of an MP's role. We're also very excited to welcome His Excellency Dr. Tariq bin Hendi, who is the Director General of the Abu Dhabi Investment Office. Dr. Hendi leads efforts to grow and diversify Abu Dhabi's economy through private sector investment and oversees strategic initiatives that support economic growth and Abu Dhabi's reputation on the world stage. And I'm sure that's an incredibly important role as you look at the economic strategy for 2030 and for their plan for the next 50 years. Dr. Hendy's held leadership roles across a variety of prestigious institutions and sits on a number of boards. So the format today is that we'll hear from both of our panelists for about 10 minutes or so, and they'll offer some opening remarks about the relationship between Australia and the UAE. We'll then open up to a discussion. I've got some backup questions myself, but we'd really encourage you to jump onto the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your Zoom screen and pop in there any questions that you would like to ask of either of our panelists, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So to start, perhaps I can ask you, Michael, to kick off with your opening remarks.
Well, Jo, thank you so much for the introduction, and can I particularly thank my great friend Christopher Pine for the invitation on behalf of the Australia UAE Business Council to join you today, and of course to Badr Al Alama, thank you as well for co-chairing and of course your invitation too. And it is a great honour for me to join with Dr. bin Hendi, who will speak on the UAE side. Look, it's obviously been an extraordinary time globally. I was fortunate to join an APEC meeting the other night where the IMF updated their projections on global growth, and we, at last count, are looking at global contraction of 3.9% in Australia, and the economic consequences we felt are even worse. We have seen quite devastating impact from an economic perspective as a result of the pandemic. We've been able largely to ensure that the health response has kept up to speed with this very contagious virus, with fewer than 30,000 cases nationwide, which is no small feat given some of the challenges we've had. The economic consequences of that have to some degree been cushioned by the fact that the federal government, of which I'm a part, has been able to deploy more than 16% of GDP to support the economy, some $320 billion to provide that assistance. And we're now starting to see, notwithstanding a second wave that we've experienced in one state of Australia, I think a point now where we're looking at, hopefully, a sustained period with relatively low infections. We've been able to get our health system up to speed. We've been able, importantly, to get the contact tracing and other quarantine measures to an acceptable standard, which means that we are confident in advance of next week's budget that there will be some opportunity for significant rebound and significant growth as we move into 2021. And whilst I'm speaking about the budget next week, can I also acknowledge another of my colleagues on this call, the Honourable Erica Betts, who just highlights the strength in the government of the relationship that we have with the UAE. Now, today is obviously predominantly about foreign investment, and I think Australia stands to some degree apart from many comparable jurisdictions in being a country that is well known for absolutely welcoming foreign investment. But the circumstances that we find ourselves in the pandemic have led to some short-term measures that we've put in place, which I'll speak about. And there's been a longer-term piece of work that the Treasurer has been undertaking really for the last 2 years, which has culminated in some reforms to the foreign investment review framework here in Australia that I'm sure many of you will be interested in. And that the culmination of that work is now being consulted upon, and I'll be speaking a bit about that too. In relation to the first issue, there was significant community concern in Australia and indeed within the government that in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, that depressed asset values would essentially mean a range of assets, businesses that would ordinarily be screened through our foreign investment review framework would not be, given the depressed nature of those assets falling below particular thresholds, which led us at the end of March to announce temporary reductions to the screening thresholds, effectively reducing those screening thresholds to nil, which meant the purview of the Foreign Investment Review Board therefore captured a wider range of transactions. Now, from my perspective as the Assistant Treasurer, which handles the vast majority of foreign investment review applications, this has not seen in any way a material difference in the way they've been handled, and certainly hasn't changed the likelihood of them obtaining approval. All they have done is provided the government with the purview of the full suite of investments into Australia at a time when I think quite understandably those depressed asset values meant we wanted to have greater oversight. So I know there's been some concern that transactions that would ordinarily pre-29 March this year, which would ordinarily have not required the process through the Foreign Investment Review Board now does. We are cognizant of that. We are trying to make that process as simple and as light touch as possible. And these are just temporary reductions. At this stage, although no final decision has been made, we would be seeking to revert back to the ordinary state of play from the 1st of January next year. But of course, we'll make those final decisions with the full suite of information at that time. And given, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, that we are, touch wood, confident that Australia is now entering a sustained period with low infection rates, with low, if not zero, community transmission, that we can look forward to business as usual from a foreign investment review framework perspective. Now, the second aspect of our FIRB rules that I wanted to touch on today was really the longer term reforms that the government commenced reviewing about 2 years ago now, that have just recently been announced, and what they practically mean. And I think there's, from a typical foreign investor, some areas of joy in these changes, and no doubt some areas of clarification that will be required, and I'm very happy to provide them today. In essence, we've made 3 broad changes that have been announced, and again, we're still consulting on much of the fine detail, but 3 broad changes which ensure that we have additional screening for acquisitions that pose a national security risk. And I'm sure, Joe, that there'll be many questions about what that means exactly and what those businesses are likely to entail. That is fairly consistent with many other jurisdictions around the world. We strengthen the existing system in many respects, including the fee framework to ensure it's less capricious, shall we say. I think one of the significant criticisms over the years has been that the fee framework has made little sense at a range of levels. So we've certainly tried to streamline and strengthen that and ensure that it's more intuitive. And importantly, we put in place a hard cap on the quantum of the fee, which previously it wasn't. And probably most importantly, and I suspect of great interest to some of the people on this call is streamlining the investment in non-sensitive businesses, and also ensuring that certain acquirers, funds in particular, who pose little risk, who have previously been screened because investors in those funds include foreign government entities, are less likely to require the FGI screening. I think that is a sensible reform, one that will facilitate a lot more speedy transactions, and we hope will be something that also assists in our relationship with the UAE. Before I wrap up, Joe, I'll just say a few words about our relationship with the UAE. Obviously, Christopher did some fantastic work in his previous portfolio, well, his most recent portfolio before leaving politics, in defence and in other areas. And as I said earlier, particularly in response to another member of the government being on this call, I can assure you that we view the relationship with the UAE as being, in many respects, a gateway for the entire region. And I think we're at a level that's not particularly mature, although growing. And from a Australian government perspective, I can assure you that we are very keen to develop our trade, and that includes welcoming investment from the UAE and indeed facilitating the investment of Australian companies into the UAE as well. So I might leave my remarks there, Joe, but again, I thank everybody for being on the call.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Michael. And now I'd like to pass over to Tariq.
Hi, thank you, Joe. And I feel very privileged to be on this first webinar. I agree with the Honourable Christopher. It'd be much nicer to be meeting everyone in person. At the end of the day, we are tactile creatures, and it would be great to be able to shake everyone's hand and say hello, but this will have to do for now. I'd like to second what the Honourable Michael had mentioned as it relates to the relationship between Australia and the UAE. I think it's very important that we look at what's happened in 2020. And actually, there are a lot of positive takeaways from 2020. One primary takeaway from this is from this year is that even though countries went into lockdown and quarantine and had various ways of trying to deal with what we all were experiencing, the fact that relationships on a global scale mattered in terms of trying to tackle this problem only highlights the need to reinforce these already very strong relationships that we have with a lot of our international partners. And I want to say that if you look at our relationship with Australia, I think it's apt, and I'll share some anecdotal information, but working from home today, I thought it would be interesting to have to display some of the Aboriginal art that we collected on a trip to Australia once, which is displayed proudly behind me. And I think that there's a lot that we share in terms of culture and history, and that move from, you know, how it is that we have grown as economies from, you know, what were very tribal systems into, you know, top 30 economies in the world. I think if you look at the way that the UAE and Australia have built this relationship, I mean, it has grown substantially between 2015 and 2019. You know, we stand at about $4 billion worth of trade going from the UAE to Australia. And I think that's a very important aspect to remember, is that the UAE is Australia's largest trade partner in this region. And so that's a critical point in the Arab world. That's a critical point to highlight. The thing I would like to focus on the most, at least in my remarks here, is that 2020 has been quite a positive experience, I have to say, even though I think that we would like to have experienced it very differently, considering what the outlook was in 2019. But I think one of the takeaways from this is that our response as a government, if you look at the UAE and particularly in Abu Dhabi, with how it is that we responded, it's been very agile, but it's also been very consistent. So we talk about our strategic long-term plans, our focus on innovation, that move away from looking at basic industries to looking at how it is that we can expand those basic industries by reinforcing a knowledge economy, innovation, and by working on these long-term partnerships to really help drive the growth of all of the industries that we have here in the UAE. One area I'd like to focus on is agriculture. If you look at the historical relationship between the UAE and Australia, there's a lot of investment that comes out of the UAE into Australia in agriculture. One thing that we're trying to do now is then work on those relationships and try to bring some of that innovation and knowledge back to the UAE and work with our partners in Australia to help grow that sector in the UAE, because we do have food security requirements. Now, the way that we do that, and I'm very proud to say that as the investment office, the Abu Dhabi Investment Office, which was founded last year by the Abu Dhabi government to help drive FDI, is they have a lot of financial and non-financial instruments that we use to try to drive that FDI and knowledge economy development in the UAE across multiple sectors. And so we want to use financial tools to be able to partner with these institutions and governments globally to be able to drive that expansion and strengthening each of those sectors that we have in the UAE. So I'd highlighted agriculture. If you look at what we're doing today, we're working, and we've recently, as the investment office, announced 4 transactions, just over $100 million. We will be announcing a few more transactions in the next couple of months, also quite a substantial investment on our side in terms of bringing those companies over. But what is it we're trying to do is 2 things, really, in essence. One is, as I've mentioned, expand those sectors to cater to our requirements. But 2 is use Abu Dhabi as a hub to expand into the region and then to share that technology and innovation with the rest of the countries that mirror some of our economic structure. So arid climate regions, in Africa, in the wider region, and look at how it is that we can bring those technologies and expand it into that area using agriculture as an example. And we're doing this across things on renewables. We're working with partners like my Abu Dhabi colleague Badr at Mubadala, and we work across all those institutions to try to drive those strategic sectors. It's the financial services is a very strong relationship between ourselves and Australia. We want to keep expanding that. And so I suppose what I'm trying to say is that we, as the investment office, we welcome that investment in Abu Dhabi. We're trying to drive that ambition and the long-term vision of our leadership with very strong partnerships from around the world. We have a lot of instruments that we can utilize to be able to drive that. And we want to make sure that we are your central gateway and hub to everything that is Abu Dhabi. And we will make sure that we cater to all of your questions, requirements, comments, feedback. We want to make sure that we are pushing the narrative. And because of the flat structure in Abu Dhabi, from a leadership perspective, change comes very quickly. We're able to be very nimble as it relates to catering to the requirements that different entities have. So I'll end just by saying that it's a privilege again to be speaking to all of you. I do look forward to being able to meet with you in person, including my fellow panelists. I don't even get to see better in person, so looking forward to meeting all of you. And please do share any feedback, requirements. We want to keep building on these relationships. We want to keep driving this growth. And I want to keep hiring Australians to work with me, because I'm very privileged to have a few Australians working with me at the investment office, one of whom is a very active member with the Australia UAE Business Council, and we're going to keep growing that relationship. So thank you very much. I'll now pass it back over to Joe, and look forward to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your comments. It's undeniably a fascinating time that we meet virtually in. The world and every economy in it, in the grapples of economic and social implications of COVID. Here in Australia, of course, we're facing the first recession in nearly 30 years. We've closed our international borders. We've, for the first time, restricted travel within our own country. As Michael said, we've pumped unprecedented amount of support into the economy, not just through fiscal spending, but through the liquidity channel and through temporary adjustments to regulation, things like insolvency laws, for example. Just for those on the call that may not be aware, population growth has been something that's always been incredibly important to Australia's economic prospects. We're an immigrant nation, born and built on that. And with our borders closed, we will experience the slowest population growth in over 100 years. So there's a variety of challenges out there for us, and certainly maintaining strong relationships with our trading partners and deepening those relationships will be an important part of recovery. We've also seen COVID-19 throw a spotlight on the resilience of supply chains, the need for a more diverse export sector, and a shift towards greater protectionism actually around the world. So I might start while we start getting some questions from the audience. And again, I'd encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A. But I might start throwing a question to you, Michael. An economy in recession, I think we all agree it's a slow grind out, to use the words from our treasurer, Frydenberg. How do you describe the shape and the timing of economic recovery? And I guess for this audience, what does that mean for investment opportunities?
Well, Joe, I mean, I think the Treasurer's description is right, and particularly when you've got ongoing travel restrictions and not just international travel, but as you rightly point out, intra-Australia travel between our states and territories who have imposed travel restrictions amongst themselves, which makes that pathway out of recession a little bit harder. I think, you know, in the end, we feel as though we've been able to maintain a relatively high level of productive capacity in the economy through the wage guarantee that we put in place, a more than $100 billion program, which has ensured that employees have remained connected to their employers, and also through some other measures that we've put in place to ensure that small and medium enterprises, to the greatest extent possible, have been able to withstand either a short or, in some cases, an extended period of severe restrictions. And so we are very hopeful, and the signs are reasonably strong in the states and territories that have emerged from the pandemic in good shape, that productive capacity in the economy remains. For example, 55% of all jobs lost have returned relatively quickly, and there's a significant lag, as I said, in Victoria, which for those who don't know Australia particularly well is 25% of the economy. So it shows that I think we've been able to successfully maintain that capacity, which gives me some cause for optimism, Joe, that as we head into calendar year 21, that we'll be able to see a resurgence in economic activity. Now, of course, again, to touch on a point that you rightly raise, Australia has really relied for many decades on significant population growth, predominantly made up of net overseas migration. Now, that's not going to be the case, not by design, but just by circumstance, really over the next 12 months. So we are, I can assure you, on the hunt for any opportunity. And I must say I'm involved in a task force being led by Alan Tudge and Minister Birmingham, our Trade Minister, and others, which is really actively out there, rather than passively telling the world, as I'm telling our friends in the UAE today, that we're open for business, rather than being passive, actually quite aggressively, in a sense, trying to roll out the red carpet for them and to explain why Australia is such a great place to do business, why our legal system and rule of law and stable political system, relatively stable, provides great opportunities into the Asia-Pacific region. So rather than being passive, Joe, I think we are going to be much more aggressive in trying to attract that mobile foreign capital. You know, that's a part of the message that I really wanted to convey today.
Do you know, I think that's a really important message, and thank you for your answer. And that is, you know, COVID's presented a whole heap of challenges, but there are actually deep underlying fundamentals that may be paused because of COVID, but that don't change because of COVID. And certainly in the conversations I have with our clients, I talk a lot about the deep fundamentals that Australia has, including some of the things you talked about, and also just how resilient our financial balances are across government, across our banking sector, across our central bank, and actually our corporate sector. So I guess if I think about that question, perhaps Tariq, can I ask you, how are you finding doing business in the COVID environment?
It's actually an interesting one. I've been asked this question quite a lot recently by people, and I have to say, I second what Michael was saying. I don't think I have been this busy ever in my career. And when I look at the questions, the requests, the demands from the private sector, what we've seen is we've seen quite a few things, a couple of things that really stood out. One is that the private sector, depending on the sector again, have been quite proactive working with the government in terms of trying to disrupt their own business model. And what I mean by that is they've been looking to the government, because we play a very active partnership role with the private sector in Abu Dhabi, have been looking to us for in terms of really re-institutionalizing technology. We're seeing a lot of technology replacement of old systems. Has been really important. Because of COVID, you are very adjusted to for most human capital of everyone that resides here, and we're going into full quarantine, actually brought about a lot of interest from some companies around the region, but also on an international level, that were like, we actually like this. We like the program that has been introduced. We like the fact that you're very responsive and that you're focusing on the human element side of things. And so we're interested in finding out more. Now, what that actually translates into over the long term, we will see. But we've seen a lot of companies come and set up Abu Dhabi. Again, to Michael's point, there's a lot of benefit here to being proactive. Now, one final thing I want to say on that is that, again, we don't look at these relationships on a transactional basis. We look at all of these relationships from a long-term relationship base, right? We want to build resiliency into the model. We also want to de-risk the experience that companies and ultimately the people those companies have when they come to South Lebanon. Why? If I look at the incentives that we offer, they're quite phenomenal. But we want to use those incentives to make sure that we're driving talent migration to Abu Dhabi, and that we're also using capital to move to flow between both countries, so that we can really expand what is this already working quite well in Australia, for example, and be able to benefit from that from an investment perspective, so a return on equity perspective. But then from a UAE Abu Dhabi perspective, look at the return on economy base. So they're both ROEs to a certain extent here, but one is very different in terms of the resiliency we're trying to build into our economy. And if I may, Joe, only because a question has come up here, and I'm not sure if you're seeing these as well, but there was a question here on investments on education and research programs. And I'll answer this more broadly, and we can provide more details to Kerry separately. But this is the core of what it is that is driving all of our investment today and the way that we're approaching capital deployment, at least from a government perspective. Yes, we have the largest sovereign wealth fund in the region, IDF, and they have investments that they make. But from a strategic perspective, we want to make sure that we're building on R&D. We want to make sure that all our programs are joint programs, so that we're able to capitalize on what has been created in Australia and also help drive that knowledge creation here. But I think more importantly, what we want to try to do is try to understand how it is that we can help those enterprises and entities pivot and localize for this region and then expand into the wider region from Abu Dhabi. And that's the way that we design our incentives. So I want to reiterate what Michael had said here about the need for proactive measures and the need to push really hard to drive that immigration. I mean, 9 out of every 10 people in UAE is a foreigner, right? And we're very proud of that stat, and we want that to keep growing. So, sorry, that was a very long answer, Joe, but I had a lot to say there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Take as long as you like. Everyone's here to listen to the two of you, certainly not to me. We have had a question come through for you, Michael, and I'm actually going to preface it by saying I think we need to acknowledge just how hard the government has been working this year. I know I've been working hard, and I just imagine it's unimaginable when you're trying to set policy in a world where you're being hit by something you've never seen before, and the health side and the economic side moving just so quickly. But there is a question here about, are there plans to advance the discussions on the stalled Australia GCC free trade agreement? Are there plans to commence discussions on a double taxation agreement? And what can those on this call perhaps do to support that or get involved in that?
Look, Joe, I must say, in a number of these sorts of forums, we inevitably get to free trade agreements and DTAs as well as having somewhat stalled this year. We all know that the time and the energy involved in these are quite intensive. And certainly as you get closer to concluding an agreement, they tend to become even more elongated. So I'm sorry, and and I do apologise. There has been a number of these arrangements that have not progressed significantly over the last 6 months. One of the things we are looking at post-budget, though, is certainly resourcing on our end to make sure that we're able to be more ambitious as to either the free trade agreements or the double taxation agreements that we're able to, in a sense, concurrently negotiate. And in that context, I would be very keen to ensure that the GCC and certainly our relationship with the UAE is able to be enhanced by progressing these much more swiftly. It feels like we've been talking about these things for a long time, I acknowledge, but we are certainly working towards that. And having said all that, Joe, I wouldn't ever want those sorts of formal type of arrangements to slow us down from some of the things that Tariq spoke about. And we've got a great story to tell, and I think I saw as I was flicking through the call list earlier, we've got Peter Macrina from Tribe Infrastructure, who's a great example, who have simultaneously done work in the UAE in the ag tech space with I think a large hydroponic project, and on the other side have certainly facilitated technology from the other direction into a Perth waste to energy facility. So I just give Peter a shout out because I think we, whilst it's very important, Joe, to keep moving the ball in the right direction on those formal type of arrangements, including a double tax agreement, which just makes life a little bit easier. We shouldn't allow any hold-ups in that space to slow us down from really trying to achieve the enhanced two-way trade that Tariq so eloquently spoke about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And Michael, there is a follow-up question which is super short, and that is, can you just remind us of the Macquarie Bank focused fund that looks at the UAE and Saudi Arabia?
I don't have a particularly great knowledge of it. I might defer to you even, Joe, if you know a little bit more. I mean, I know tangentially it's certainly focused in the right areas, and I think has been put in place because it acknowledges that, yes, whilst the UAE is our largest trading partner in the region, it's not as mature as we'd like, and the opportunities are absolutely significant. And the Macquarie Bank is, for anyone that's dealt with them, including my Chief of Staff, who's a former Macquarie Bank employee, I think in the UAE, that they are absolutely on the front line with Australia's relationship. But I must say, Joe, in the last few months, with a focus on the myriad of challenges we've had, including what's coming up next week with our budget, I can't say I'm the full bottle, sadly, on that particular.
Fair enough. Well, I'm a very proud Macquarie Bank alumni. I've had 15 years there, so I'm a big supporter, and I worked in our FX department, which was also had quite a bit of work early on with the UAE. Perhaps I'll swing back to you, Tariq. We talked in the opening remarks a little bit about the economic strategy for 2030 and for the next 50 years. if you had sort of 2 or 3 points from that you wanted for this audience, for Australians to understand what that's driving for and what our role may be in that is as your own economy starts to change and shift, I think that would be really useful.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I have to say that when all these strategies are put in place, they're typically put in place from an aspirational perspective. So I remember in the mid-90s when it is that we were looking at what we wanted the UAE to look like by 2021, and let's forget 2020 for a moment, right? There were strategies about the aspirations. We hit many of those milestones right before the financial crisis. So we were a good 12 years ahead of our plans. And so what we do is we try to put a lot of aspirational targets on ourselves as a country, because I think I know what the government is doing is that they're trying to place that hope into the wider population here in terms of being able to do different things. There's a reason why we sent the Hope probe to Mars, and that is to drive that curiosity, right? This is a key driver of what it is the government is doing. If any economy is going to move away from mediocrity, you've got to give people some aspirational aspect to look at. And so this is what it is that the government tries to drive very extensively through all of the programs. I'll give you an example. Today in Abu Dhabi, they just announced that there was a wide educational and exposure program with some of the leading Ivy League universities in the US, open to the community here in Abu Dhabi to be able to participate and learn and do different things. So that knowledge component is quite critical. Now, if I take it back to the question that was asked as it relates to how it is that we look at solidifying the economy and so on, we understand that there are sectors that we are very advanced in, petrochemicals, downstream, advanced materials that we're trying to grow now, the aerospace industry, financial services, at least from a regional perspective. But there's still room to grow there. And then there are other areas that we want to develop, biomedical space, the pharmacological space, right? We're strong in logistics, but we want to make sure that we get the end-to-end structure right. We've got very dominant players here. And, there was a very strong relationship between a publicly listed entity here in Aramex with Australia Post as one of the largest shareholders previously. So there's a lot of knowledge that's already been transferred, and we want to build on that. And so I suppose the best way for me to answer that question, Joe, is to say that we have strategies for those sectors and clusters. We're looking at how it is that we can expand. The benefit to Australian companies by being on this journey with us is that you have a seat at the table. And this is a key component to how it is that we conduct business, is that we want the private sector to push the government to, one, become more agile, but two, adjust to cater to the requirements of the private sector. Over the last 6 months, we have seen policy changes in the UAE that would normally have taken multiple years to institutionalize. That's one, a testament to the fact that the government is quite agile, but two, how much we've opened up to the private sector being the voice of what it is that the government should be doing. And our job is enablement, and it's to be able to catalyze these sectors through financial instruments and through support for these various initiatives. And so one thing I would stress here is that for any of the companies in Australia that are looking for investment or looking for growth opportunities, right? Because this ultimately will feed back into the Australian economy to benefit local employment, to benefit revenue streams, so on and so forth, is that if you want a seat at the table and you want us to and you want to help us drive that change in policy and help us grow, please reach out. We want to make sure that we're working with long-term strategic partners and build an economy on non-transaction, long-term relationships. So I think that's the best way to explain how we approach our long-term strategies from an economic perspective.
I think it's fantastic, and that's a great call to arms for everyone on this call. It's actually also a great segue into a question I wanted to ask you, Michael, and that is, and I'm sure you have the same, but when I talk to foreign investors overseas, one of the comments I often get is, oh, Australia, when times are tough, you just go west and dig stuff out of the ground. you're a resource economy and not much else, which those of us that live and work in Australia know is simply not true. But I guess from your perspective, Michael, what sectors are exciting you? I mean, we're having a debate domestically, obviously, about advanced manufacturing, but outside of resources, you know, we are so much more than that. So what excites you?
Well, Joe, look, there's no doubt that, you know, large swathes of what underpins our economy are, in some respects, very traditional in mining and agriculture, although, you know, agriculture to some degree is not the sort of bulk commodity that I think many of us think about, you know, historically with Australian industry. I think it's much more agile, and when we look at manufacturing, our largest sector within manufacturing is food processing and manufacturing. So, so yes, Joe, there's no doubt that that's the prevailing view. I think, you know, if you look at the strength of our banking system and indeed our fledgling fintech space, the government through open banking and other reforms, our regulatory sandbox has really tried to ensure that in that fintech space, you know, Australia is really up there with our major counterparts in ensuring that talented Australian entrepreneurs are able to do what Australia has not typically done well, which is we're great at in the ideas space. We're not great at commercialising them, but actually providing those pathways and most importantly the capital to commercialisation. So fintech's one, advanced manufacturing, and to some degree that includes and encompasses medical devices, particularly as a Victorian, I must say, is an area of great growth. And indeed, one of our great success stories as a country is CSL, which is now, by market capitalisation, one of our largest companies, which has a presence all around the world in you know what I think, particularly in the middle of a pandemic, we all recognise is a phenomenally strategically important company that is still Australian in every respect. So I would say, you know, they're the areas, Joe, but I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily at to some degree emphasising that even though mining and agriculture, you know, to some degree doesn't excite people, these are in many respects very, very high-tech industries. You look at our iron ore manufacturing, iron ore processing now, and the technology involved. It's quite phenomenal just how far something is that's not particularly glorifying, digging iron ore out of the ground, but the technology involved is phenomenal.
I think it's a really interesting comment, actually. I think people often think about our resource base as actually fairly low value add basic, but we are incredibly innovative in mining. And I do absolutely agree that in other sectors of our economy, we need to learn to commercialise some of that innovation a little bit better. And that comes out consistently in those global surveys. We've got a very esteemed panel today.
Joe, do you mind if I just add one thing to what Michael said? And this is an important part, right? Is that some people look at these traditional industries and they go, okay, that's an old industry, it's quite boring, right? But if you look at the innovation from an environmental perspective, but also an efficiency perspective, those are the key drivers of what we're doing. If we're going to create some of these industries in the UAE, we want to work with partners that have built these traditional businesses and then pivoted them to make sure they adopt that technology and they adapt their business model to be able to capitalize on the innovation that they're creating. So I think I second what Michael has said here about these industries. I think that from what we have seen working with some of the Australian companies, there's a lot of innovation coming out of these traditional industries, and we really want to partner and work with those firms to come here and help us in some of those areas, and also for us to be able to show you what we've done with some of the advanced manufacturing, with the petrochemical side, and so on, help exchange that information. That's critical. So sorry to interrupt you, but I did want to second what Michael had said there in terms of the point.
Oh, very valuable comments. So thank you for that. I am going to take the opportunity to throw a question to Christopher Pine, seeing as we're so lucky to have him on the call as well. He thought he was going to get away with just the introduction, but we have got a question for you, Christopher, and I think it's one that probably has some broader interest. And that is, are there discussions to ease defence export controls?
Well, thank you, Joe. And just very quickly, because a lot of what Michael and Tariq have been saying is, it's been very interesting to me because they've picked up on the 4 areas that the Australia UAE Business Council has decided to focus on from a business point of view. We have members of the advisory board on the call as well. David Ruff from Babcock International, Ellie May Saffron from May Saffron, both of whom have spent many years working in the UAE, and of course His Excellency Abdullah Al Sabusi, who's the UAE ambassador, and they should all be recognised along with Erica Betts. And I'm glad Michael picked up that Erica Betts is also on the call, and it's great to have him involved because we have, as a council, decided to focus on advanced manufacturing, which I notice is one of the areas of interest, particularly in areas like space and defence, in sustainable food production, because most people will know on this webinar that if you're eating fresh food and produce in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, there's a 70% chance you're eating Australian produce because of that's a big part of our exports into the Emirates. Education, sport and tourism, and services as a third area we're going to focus on, and of course foreign investment. So there'll be the 4 working groups and the 4 subjects that we're trying to cover. Just quickly on defence, and I'd actually quite like to ask Michael and Tariq a question about Israel and the UAE normalising their relationships with Israel if we get the chance before we finish. The export of defence products to UAE is pretty open. It's pretty good. It needs to grow. The only area where we don't allow exports of defence products or non-defence products that could have dual uses are in things that might be able to be used in Yemen, because obviously we have a policy around the conflagration in Yemen, which precludes us exporting defence products that might be used in Yemen. But apart from that, we have 2 military bases in the Emirates. We have a very close relationship to them, and if an Australian defence industry company wants to export a product or a service to the Emirates, they'd be hard pressed to have that rejected unless they couldn't guarantee that it would find its way into the Yemeni conflict. So that's a great thing, because I think as a former defence minister and defence industry minister, that's a great interest to me, but that needs to be explored as part of that ongoing advanced manufacturing space and defence part of our brief.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm very conscious of time. I feel like we could go for another hour or so, but I might just wrap up with one more question that we've had from the audience, and perhaps I can ask Michael and Tariq to make a comment about this. And again, it's perhaps another call to arms for those that are on this call, and that is, how can we get more SME participation in the relationship between Australia and the UAE?
Well, Joe, thank you, and Christopher, thank you for letting me know that Ambassador Al Sabusi is on the line, who is doing a wonderful job in Canberra, and I've met him on a couple of occasions. So, Ambassador, wonderful you're on the call. I think, ultimately, Joe, this forum will play as big a role as any, I suspect, in breaking down those connections for SMEs who are less likely to be able to, invest in directly invest in the sorts of relationships that you need to in a sense open those doors. And I think that's why I was so keen today to support the Business Council, because we've seen, certainly in a range of other much more mature, from our perspective, mature trading relationships, that the sort of fledgling chambers or business councils in this case are often the catalyst for those sorts of investments. So you know, I'm hoping that can be the case. Obviously, through DFAT, Joe, we invest a lot to try and facilitate that sort of trade, and it's you know, encouraging to hear and see the perspectives on this call. On Christopher's point around normalisation of, you know, relationships between Israel and others in the region, including the UAE, that's obviously you know, something that assists, and of course our trading relationship with the UAE in that respect is actually much more mature than Israel. So that's a long-winded way of saying, Joe, that I think SMEs will need their hand held to some degree a bit more, and the Business Council and DFAT, I think, are probably the only bodies likely to be able to do that. And of course, as you get momentum, the people-to-people links mean inevitably that becomes easier. But I think at this point in time, the Business Council, whilst it's focused on those 4 core areas, to some degree might limit it in the short term. I hope in time will facilitate much more trade in the SME space.
I think they're fantastic
Joe, and
comments.
I'll just give you a 30-second insight from my side on SMEs. And I think that it's a challenging question to not sound cliche when you're answering this question as it relates to SMEs, because the S component versus the M component are very different needs and requirements, right? And so what we've tried to do is, if we've looked at the S's really as sort of an outcome of the right policies and the right programs from the government, and then the existing S's and M's and how it is that we can take them and grow them into you know, kind of institutional size firms through mandatory procurement laws in the government that stipulate that 10 to 15% of every contract has to go to an SME is one example, but then also providing credit guarantees, of which I sit on the SME committee, credit guarantee committee for Abu Dhabi, and I see what it is that they're looking for. And so one thing I would just say is that if an entity has aspirations to grow, or there are people that have an idea that want that to foster that idea, we're happy to support them on that journey. And we do see a lot of larger SMEs looking to work with us in the UAE. And now with the normalization of ties with Israel, I think this could be a fantastic way of driving innovation into a fast growing young region and economy using tried and tested methods from Australia, and have a very nice symbiotic relationship going across the 3. And so for me, again, it's that discussion about curiosity and a seat at the table. And I think we've been able to accomplish that through normalization of ties with Israel. And let's see how it is that we can drive that through our other partnerships as well.
Fantastic. And look, I couldn't think of 2 better answers to conclude our panel today. Thank you, both of you, so much for your time, for your insights, but also your honesty and your frankness. I love the call to arms that we've heard for those of us on the call today. I myself have learned a lot about this relationship. And what I hear is, you know, we have a strong and solid and deep relationship already, but plenty of opportunities to expand that, deepen it, strengthen it for everyone's advantage. And as an economist and a vehement believer in globalization, you know, they are good messages to hear. So thank you again for your time. And thank you to the Council as well for having me along. It's been a pleasure to moderate, and really enjoyed listening to this conversation. So thanks to all of you.